What's up everyone, it's Sprometheus, and today I'm going to go over what I learned from brewing and tasting the last 3 years winning recipes for the World Aeropress Championship. For those of you who have been around the channel for a while and watched a few of my videos, you may have seen or heard me talk about my general dislike, or maybe distaste is a more appropriate term. I don't know, are those two the same thing? But either way, I just don't really like immersion brewing methods because they just sort of taste off to me.
Well, could just eat it.
God, I hate it.
You know, I talk about cold brew and things like that, so when it comes to an AeroPress, it fell off my radar relatively quickly once I started learning about things like V60, and then swiftly going into espresso, I kind of just fell off my AeroPress game altogether. Now, I've had an AeroPress for quite a while. It was one of my earliest investments in coffee because it's just so cheap and generally easy, and it's actually really versatile in terms of what you can do with it. My biggest issue with the AeroPress was I generally got one of two results. The first would either be very sour and over-extracted and heavy and dense. There'd be sediment and, oils and all sorts of stuff in the cup that I just personally don't like. And on the other end, when I tried to brew it a little bit cleaner, I would get something that was more like tea, where it had just a very weak body, very light in terms of the flavors, and just generally not that great of a cup of coffee. And like I mentioned before, from there it was basically put on the bottom shelf of my coffee cart and collected dust until recently, when I came across the World Aeropress Championship website, which goes over in detail how to brew all of their winning recipes. And so I grabbed the last 3 years winning recipes and decided to put them to the test and see if I could really elevate my AeroPress game. After brewing all 3 of those winning recipes on multiple occasions, I found 6 different key points that all of those recipes utilize in really elevating the cup of coffee you can get from your AeroPress, and I felt like that's something that's worth sharing. When I first began making AeroPresses, the recipes were extremely simple and generally had a dose that was between your standard espresso and pour over, usually ranging between 15 and 20 grams. In contrast, all of the winning recipes from the World Aeropress Championship from the last 3 years all used between 30 and 35 grams of coffee, which is a pretty huge increase from that standard 15 to 20. Now, the way those larger doses translate into the cup is pretty interesting, but for this specific lesson, I think it's important to understand that the larger the dose, the harder it is to over-extract the coffee. So when you add that 30 to 35 grams of coffee to your AeroPress recipe, and it's only brewed for maybe a minute to maybe 2 minutes max, it's very difficult to over-extract that coffee. Also, the other interesting benefit that's also not really a benefit is it makes these huge, impressive pucks of coffee that are just kind of fun to look at. When I first started doing AeroPresses, I looked at them almost like an extension of espresso. I didn't think of them as kind of just a standalone cup of coffee, or really look at them as a versatile tool. I looked at them like, okay, I need to grind fine, press hard, and push this water through the puck, and that was basically it. And like I mentioned before, what I ended up creating was either just a weird, over-extracted, dense cup of coffee that tasted like just an Americano gone wrong, or I tasted something that just tasted like tea and wasn't all that interesting. But what I did notice is that every single one of these winning AeroPress recipes all ground their coffee pretty coarse. Now, they didn't really say or go into a detail or even show a picture of what coarse actually means, but they did give you just a 1 to 10, 1 being fine, 10 being coarse, and all 3 of these winning recipes ground their coffee between 7 and 8. So to me, if you're trying to create a good cup of coffee and not something that really closely resembles espresso, this is the way to get that result out of an AeroPress. Grinding coarse allows for even extraction through the grounds. There's no fines or anything like that holding things back. Plus, you don't have fines slipping out through your filter and ending up with sediment or oils or whatever you don't want in your cup of coffee. Now, up until this point, when I brewed an AeroPress, everything was contained within that AeroPress that I needed for that specific cup of coffee. So I would put my dose of coffee, the entire dose of water, brew time, whatever, stir, press, and then done. That was my final product. I didn't really consider the other options, i.e. dilution. So when you combine using a smaller dose, a finer grind, putting everything all in the AeroPress all at once, and making that your final product really is what was creating for me just an unideal cup of coffee. So the lesson here is you can use that large dose of coarsely ground coffee and just a little bit of brew water to create a really nice intense coffee concentrate that can then be diluted to make a super clean cup of coffee that can be basically designed for however you like your coffee. You basically have complete control of the strength of that coffee. So this is a little bit embarrassing to admit, but I'm just gonna put it out there. In the early days of making AeroPresses, I would basically bloom my AeroPress the same way as I would a pour over, which in reality, depending on who you ask, probably isn't the worst possible thing, but I didn't really begin stirring or agitating my blooms until maybe 2 years ago or so, when it really started becoming more apparent that that was helpful in terms of getting a good even extraction, at least in my opinion and my experience. But I didn't start doing that until very recently, and I think that also had an effect on the quality of the cup I was getting out of my AeroPress. Now, as a side note that's only slightly related to this, I do think it's important to stir the bloom of your coffee purely because you want to make sure that all those coffee grounds are wet in that bloom process. If they're not, and there's dry patches in your coffee bed, it's going to make for some uneven extraction. That's been my experience, and I think there's other people out there who've had a similar experience. But the point I'm trying to make is all the winning recipes use stirring and agitation pretty much immediately once the water was in the grounds. Some of these recipes even use terms like strongly or briskly.
I also like to live dangerously.
Some dictated the number of stirs you need to do in your AeroPress, and others used interesting methods like wooden chopsticks, which those are the type of specifics with brewing coffee that I can really nerd out on. So the lesson in this one is that stirring, agitation, whatever you want to call it, is important to getting even extraction and getting the most out of that coffee bed. Those of you who are familiar with the AeroPress and maybe have one, you're probably familiar with the two methods of brewing. You have your standard upright brewing method, or you have inverted. For those who brew on the upright or standard method, generally means you're putting on your filter cap with your filter already wetted and rinsed, then you're dropping in your grounds, your water into that brewing chamber, and before you're even applying pressure, it's already brewing out the bottom, which for me isn't that great because it really lacks control. I can't really control how long it actually spends with the water touching the grounds, which means I have very little control over the extraction time. So, not surprisingly, all of the winning recipes from the World Aeropress Championship use the inverted brewing method, which basically means you're flipping over the entire unit and then you're brewing on top of the plunger that you're going to press down later. So you're flipping it over, you're putting the grounds, your hopes, your dreams, your water, whatever you want to put in there, and then you can do your stirring, you can measure the brew time, you can control all those factors, then you just put the filter cap on, flip it over, press down, and you're done. So that seems to be generally the best way to go about brewing an AeroPress. Now, the AeroPress has been out for quite some time, and when a coffee product is that prolific and it's been out for that many years and it's relatively inexpensive, people will start making accessories for it and really trying to elevate the product's game. You'll find hundreds of products for the AeroPress out there, including different types of filters, metal, plastic, pressure actuated, all these different things you can find online. I've had the pleasure of trying a few myself, and they're good products. I did the Fellow Prismo, I've done Cafe Concetto's metal filters, but in the end, the paper filter, for me, still reigns supreme. After looking up and trying all these World Aeropress Championship winning recipes, I was pleasantly surprised to see that every single one of these winning recipes uses just a good old-fashioned paper disc. The reason why the paper filter has held its own throughout this onslaught of competitors is that it really does create, at least in my opinion, and it appears to be other people's opinions, the best possible cup of coffee because it really filters out lots of oils, sediments, fines, all sorts of things that can slip by a standard metal filter or something like that and really cause the cup of coffee quality, in my opinion, to decrease. So what it really comes down to is that the good old-fashioned paper filter really creates the cleanest cup of coffee you can make with an AeroPress. After spending a lot of time with the AeroPress and really kind of digging into some of the unique pieces of it and learning how it functions and how to make the best cup of coffee possible from it, I think that the AeroPress will find its way back into my normal coffee routine on a regular basis. These recipes are game changers, and they're just so genuinely simple and easy to recreate at home. There's really no excuse to not give them a try. I highly recommend you brewing them up, especially if you haven't had a good cup from an AeroPress in a long time like myself prior to this experience, because it'll really change your view on the AeroPress in general. And if you do, you can thank me in the comments later. And of course, a big thank you to my May Patreons: Ads, James B, David, Hamad, Christopher, John K, Squeegee, Ro, Brian, Lisa, Thomas B, Andre, Rick Racer, Sean, Joey, Thomas S, Noel, Spookus, Bound Coffee, Mika, Samantha, Nathan, Aiden, Jonathan, Claire, Steven, James K, Josh, Andrew, Ollie, Ninja Warrior Coffee, and Testing 123. And of course, a big thank you to the barista and barback tiers. If you want any information on my Patreon, there's a link in the description and in the upper right hand corner right now. And lastly, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that little bell button for notifications of new videos posted every Friday. Follow me on Instagram at Sprometheus for content throughout the week, my blog at Sprometheus.com, my coffee at littlegiant.coffee, and as always, stay caffeinated. Pony Boy.